Hello folks, and welcome back to yet another episode of Rank 'Em All, where we rank the full discography from different metal bands. And today we're going to rank all the albums by Sodom. And Sodom is a German thrash metal band, one of the big German bands, alongside Creator and Destruction. Their bassist and vocalist Tom Angelripper has led the band through different lineups ever since the early 80s. And let me tell you, this discography was real hard to rank. They have so many albums that are more or less equally good. So it was real tricky to put together this list. It's definitely the toughest one so far. But I think that I've managed to put together a pretty solid list. But if I would have done this ranking again 6 months from now, I might have rearranged it a bit. Especially towards the middle and the bottom half. So it depends a bit on what mood I'm in when I do these rankings. They are not absolutely set in stone, but I'm pretty happy with my top picks here. So if you're a Sodom fan, then make sure to smash that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on, because now it's time to rank Sodom's full discography. In 16th place were Masquerade in Blood from 1995. And even if I rank this as Sodom's worst album, it's actually a masterpiece in comparison to what some of the other thrash metal bands were doing at the time. Don't get me wrong here, Masquerade in Blood is somewhat lackluster, but Sodom never sunk as low as Metallica, Megadeth or Anthrax for example. A bad Sodom album is still a pretty decent album. There are some Motorhead worship going on here, because this is dirty and straightforward thrash without any signs of melodies at all. The production of the album is a bit sterile, but Masquerade in Blood is a pretty decent album for 1995, when nothing else interesting was going on within the realms of thrash. Plus there weren't really any strong memorable songs on this album, so that's why I hold Masquerade in Blood as Sodom's weakest effort. Next. In 15th place we have The Final Sign of Evil, and I never understood the reason why bands think that they can re-record their classic albums, and they actually think that they can improve on them if they just gave them a more modern production. First of all, the production values of the 80s were way more authentic than the mechanized thrash of the 2010s. I really don't understand why Sodom wanted to re-record some of their old stuff. Sure, they also re-recorded a few old songs that weren't included on the original release of In the Sign of Evil. And I guess it's cool to hear some of those songs, but let's be honest here. I don't know anyone that prefers these new recordings over the old ones. But I must admit that it was kinda cool that they reunited the lineup from In the Sign of Evil to record this album. So I guess it's more of a celebration of the band's past than an actual good recording. Next. In 14th place we have Get What You Deserve from 1994. And during the mid-90s, Sodom infused some punk into their music. So Get What You Deserve is the closest thing to a crossover album that Sodom ever recorded. But I would perhaps not call it a full-on crossover album. But there is a stronger punk influence here than on all of their other records. And this album is loud and noisy and rather violent too. And I dig the song Jabba the Hutt, it was a cool track. And placing this album in 14th place feels a bit low since I think it's an alright album. But beware, because it's a rather noisy one. Next. In 13th place we have Till Death Do Us Unite. And the worst thing about this album is actually the cover art, it was just weird. And the music is straight ahead pummeling Motorhead style thrash, dirty and to the point. And there's a little more speed on the songs this time around, and I really appreciate that. This album is a bit all over the board though. There are some punkish songs, some real thrashers, and some heavy tunes. So Till Death Do Us Unite is a bit all over the place. It's not a bad record per se, but I think that Sodom had a bunch of better albums in their discography. So, next. In 12th place we have Genesis XIX or Genesis 19, and this is Sodom's latest studio album to date. This album is definitely a nod to their roots, because it's kinda structured like their early material. It's wild and straightforward and definitely to the point. It's also noisy and the riffs will definitely pummel your ears. Sure, there is a modern production here. And is this on par with their old material? No, but I think it's a cool nod to the period when technicality wasn't the band's prio number one. Next. In 11th place we have In War and Pieces from 2010. And yikes, it's been 11 years since this album came out. I would have guessed like 3 or 4 years maybe. Anyhow, In War and Pieces is a great record. Tom Angelripper sounds amazing as always. And there is actually some melody on this record, not to the Creator extent, but they dare to throw in some melodies here and there. And there are a few tracks on this album that are kinda meh, but overall In War and Pieces is a very solid Sodom record. I also dig Eliran Kantor's artwork here, it looks amazing. Next. In 10th place we have Epitome of Torture from 2013. This is one of the band's more recent efforts, and I think it's a pretty good album. But one thing that is a bit weird about it, it's Tom Angelripper's pronunciation of epitome. He sings it as epitome of torture, which was a bit weird. Anyhow, My Final Bullet, Stigmatized and Epitome of Torture are my favorite tracks on this album. And it's cool to see Sodom still delivering some dirty yet great thrash some 30 years into their career. Next. In 9th place we have Sodom's self-titled album from 2006. The production here is a bit loud and noisy, and noisy can be good, but here it's a bit too much I think. The songwriting on the other hand is very strong, and this is the follow-up to M16. But this album sounds very different. This is more aggressive and dirtier and less catchy. Still, they managed to incorporate some melody here and there, and this is a cool album and one of the better modern day Sodom records. Next. In 8th place we have Decision Day from 2016, and this was the follow-up to Epitome of Torture. And this album is in a similar style. Heck, all of their albums are in a similar style. But this is brutal Teutonic thrash, it's pure and definitely straight to the point. Rolling Thunder and Decision Day are two cool tracks that I recommend that you check out from this album. And Rolling Thunder might be the best way to describe this album as well, because it's a very powerful and potent record. It's also very well balanced, so it's not just a wall of noise. I think that Decision Day is a great modern day thrash record. This one is definitely a contender for the album of the year when it came out in 2016. Next. In 7th place we have Code Red, and it was on this album that I felt like Sodom were slowly finding their way again, after a trio of albums that in my opinion lacked a bit. And the albums that I'm thinking of are of course Get What You Deserve, Masquerade in Blood and Till Death Do Us Unite. And Sodom stripped away the punk metal sound of those records, and they started to deliver a more pure thrash experience with Code Red. And speaking of Code Red, the title track is an absolute beast. And Code Red is also one of the fastest albums that Sodom ever recorded, so what's not to like about that? And I also hold Code Red as one of the best metal albums of 1999. Next. In 6th place we have Obsessed By Cruelty, and this was the band's first full-length release. And during this period the band wrote more sinister songs about evil, death and Satan and stuff like that. The war stuff came later in their career. Often I prefer the early stuff, but Obsessed By Cruelty was never my favorite Sodom album, even if I respect them for what they did here. So I think it's not a bad album, far from it, it's just that it's so noisy, and the songwriting ain't as dynamic as on those late 80s albums. I think that Sodom really hit their stride when Frank Blackfire joined the band. I also like the track Death Like Silence, it's a very cool song. And there is a ton of reverb on this album, kinda like early Sepultura or early Creator for that matter. Also I wanna say rest in peace to Witch Hunter and Destructor, whom both played on this record. Next. In 5th place we have what I think is the most underrated album in Sodom's discography, and it's Better Off Dead from 1990. Well, Code Red might be a good contender for the most underrated Sodom album, but Better Off Dead is a very strong album in my opinion. This album came out a year after Agent Orange, and it has a similar sound to it. Maybe there aren't as many great songs on this album, but the album was produced by Harris Johns, one of the best thrash producers, and he has worked with the band since Persecution Mania. Around this time, Sodom really started to sound much better, and I don't think that's just a coincidence. And I dig Better Off Dead, but don't forget that the saw is the law. Next. In 4th place we have M16, and this album came out in 2001. This is another album about the Vietnam War, just like Agent Orange was some 12 years earlier. For me, this is an incredible album. Among the Weird Kong is a beast of an opener. Napalm in the Morning is a modern day thrash classic, and the title track is also awesome. But they could have skipped the ridiculous Surfing Bird cover, but otherwise M16 is a modern masterpiece. Next. In 3rd place we have Tapping the Vein from 1992, and this is the most brutal album that Sodom ever recorded. It's bordering to death metal. It's just murky, aggressive and full of speed. And Tom Angelripper almost growls on this record. Good stuff. And speaking of good stuff, Body Parts, that's just a beast of a track. One of the best tracks that Sodom ever wrote actually. It's just ferocious. And it's almost like Sodom turned their back on the more mainstream sounding Agent Orange, and they just went for the most menacing sound that they could think of. And I think that Tapping the Vein is a great record, and all fans of extreme music should definitely check it out. Next. In 2nd place we have the aforementioned Agent Orange, and it came out in 1989. And it's generally seen as the band's masterpiece, and I love this album. It's definitely the Sodom album that I've listened to the most over the years. Frank Blackfire was such a great addition to the band, and this album is just one of the greatest thrash records to ever come out of Europe. It's a masterpiece for sure. Agent Orange, which is the title track, is just a blistering assault on your ears. I also like Tired and Red, Incest and even the punkish Ausgebombt. And Ausgebombt is kinda similar to Bombenhagel on the Persecution Mania album. It's a punkish song with German lyrics. And Sodom really perfected the war-style thrash with this album. Next. The greatest Sodom album is in my opinion Persecution Mania from 1987. And it was here that Frank Blackfire joined the band, and he really upped their game completely. From being this kind of sloppy and murky caveman band to become one of the premier thrash bands in the world. Nuclear Winter is just one of the greatest songs that the band ever wrote. It's an absolute beast. Christ's Passion and the title track are other great songs from this album. And Bombenhagel was the speedy number that no thrasher can resist. Even the Motorhead cover Iron Fist is cool. So that's why I think that Persecution Mania is the #1 Sodom album. And now I'm curious to hear about your opinions. What's your favorite Sodom album? And feel free to rank their full discography down below if you're familiar with it. And don't forget to nuke that like button and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on, so you won't miss out when I post my next video. You can also support my tireless work by becoming a Patreon. That really helps me out, because these videos take forever to edit. And you can also get some Ruthless Metal merch at the Ruthless Metal store if you prefer it that way. And join the Discord server, folks. We are a growing community over there. We had a lot of cool metalheads, so join us. Or check out my Spotify playlists or the Facebook group. It's all listed down below. And let me know whose discography I should rank in the next episode of Rank 'Em All. And that's it, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.